people like me. You need people like me so you can point your f***ing fingers and say, that's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy.
To the mother relay, we're covering today's top boxing news.
Okay, we'll start with this. Skye Nicholson advanced to a professional record of 4 wins, no losses, and no draws this past weekend. 91 days as a professional boxer and 4 fights already in the books. Skye Nicholson herself says she wants tough fights.
If she stays on this kind of schedule, she'll get them soon enough.
Skye Nicholson looks like a fighter that's settling into a pure boxer-based style. Pure boxer, pro style. Because she only has 4 professional fights, she's an amateur standout, a former Olympian.
It takes time to transition to a more pro style.
When she completes that process, it looks a lot like Skye Nicholson will be your according to Hoyle pure boxer. Economic, efficient, defensively responsible, only throwing 1 or 2 shots at a time from a safe distance from the outside, fighting on the balls of her feet, managing the distance. That's the look of Skye Nicholson.
A southpaw with a lot of length and a lot of hand speed.
She is formidable, already looking quite formidable. And the more fights she has, the more experience she garners.
She could do with a bit of inside game.
Work on being fluid, mid-range to inside, as to not become limited to boxing from the outside and potentially becoming flustered should an opponent sail past her jab.
Get around it.
Pressure her and crowd her.
Pressuring her and crowding her.
Stylistically, your according to Hoyle pure boxer has a stylistic advantage over your according to Hoyle boxer puncher.
The defining characteristic of the pure boxer is being economic and being efficient.
Being mobile and being defensively responsible, whereas the defining characteristic of the boxer puncher is they throw a little more, come forward a little more.
In some instances, they go for the knockout.
Depending on what unique subtleties and nuances are specific to the fighter, the boxer puncher is a little bit more gung-ho than the according to Hoyle pure boxer. And the reason that pure boxer oftentimes has a stylistic advantage over that boxer puncher,
it's because they don't offer them much to counter.
Characteristically, the pure boxer doesn't offer up much for you to capitalize on.
Like what we saw this past weekend between Devin Haney and George Kambosos.
George is capable, make no mistake. But for a fighter who's looking to land big off a counter shot against someone as defensively responsible as a Devin Haney, a pure boxer who's stand behind that jab,
picking the other guy off long distance from the outside,
capitalizing off a counter shot could prove quite difficult. Waiting for that window of opportunity, that window that in many instances with a pure boxer, it doesn't open. The same is true for Skye Nicholson, just with the other hand. Skye Nicholson being a southpaw.
You know, because Devin's an orthodox fighter who leads with his left as opposed to Skye who leads with her right.
They're both pure boxers. They just fight out of different stances. Better still, the underlying principle is that the pure boxer doesn't offer up much for the boxer puncher to capitalize on. The boxer puncher that might try to jab their way within
striking distance to bring over big punches, hard punches, big right hands.
The pure boxer can hamper these efforts by controlling the distance at which the fight is being fought, not putting much out there to capitalize on, not putting much out there that can be countered, being very responsible. Boxer puncher's kryptonite really is that pure boxer.
And the pure boxer's kryptonite is that pressure fighter.
You can disarm the boxer puncher by neutralizing the boxer puncher's jab, countering that jab. It's going to make them tentative and hesitant to try to close the gap, whereas the pressure fighter
is not so easily discouraged.
Styles make fights. That's what they say. And if you really want to make a pure boxer uncomfortable, get them out of their comfort zone, you have to apply pressure. You have to squeeze them and force them to fight. That involves taking chances, but, well, pressure fighters, characteristically, that's what they do. They take chances.
Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't.
Sometimes it may be good, sometimes it may be shit.
Against the pure boxer, the reason that pressure can often be seen as a form of kryptonite for the pure boxer, the pressure that a pressure fighter applies, is because the pure boxer wants to slow the fight down, take their time, pick their shots, pick their punches, manage the distance. They don't want an all-out brawl or an all-out war. And that's the pressure fighter's calling card. That's what the pressure fighter is all about. Forget about jabbing your way in.
Fiddling and fencing with the jabs.
Looking for the right opening, waiting for the right moment to strike, the way the boxer puncher might. Forget about all that. The pressure fighter's more likely to double up or triple up on their jab, close the gap, come in hard and fast so they can crowd that pure boxer.
The pressure fighters got tendencies. They tend to fight at a slight crouch.
Staying off center, moving side to side as they close the gap, as to slip any oncoming jabs from their opponents.
Yeah, pressure fighters have tendencies.
Think Isaac Cruz in the lightweight division. Think David Lemieux, middleweight and super middleweight divisions. Think Alfredo Angulo in his heyday. Pressure fighters have certain tried and true tendencies.
Elite pressure fighters, elite ones, they're very dangerous.
Think Smokin' Joe Frazier. Think Mike Tyson in their heyday. When it comes to Skye Nicholson, there just so happens to be a very formidable pressure fighter in the featherweight division at 126 pounds. The pressure fighter just so happens to be a reigning champion, one of 3 in the featherweight division. I'm talking about Mexico's own Erica Cruz,
who hails from Mexico City. That's high altitude. That's why Erica has so much energy, has such a great gas tank.
I'll tell you now, in a few fights, Skye Nicholson might very well be ready to take on the likes of Sarah Mahfoud, who's more finesse than ferocity. Sarah Mahfoud of Denmark, this division's reigning IBF champion. Sarah's no pressure fighter, and she's not a big puncher, but Erica...
No, she could give Skye Nicholson a lot of problems.
That is, unless Skye Nicholson, over time, adds more layers to her game, particular to this conversation, more layers to her mid-range to inside game. She needs to be formidable there, just as formidable as she is mid-range to outside while she's on the fly.
Pressure fighters, they force you to fight. They force you to have to fight them off.
If you can't, if your methodology of dealing with that pressure is simply to move laterally and stay on the move, what ends up happening is you end up getting outworked.
Because you're not holding your ground, you're not getting off very many punches.
Pure boxers already economic. That's one of their tried and true characteristics. So just imagine how much more economic they are when they've got to move around.
And they don't want to engage because they don't want to get sucked into a war.
Pure boxer's kryptonite is a pressure fighter, because pressure fighters oftentimes tend to force them to fight at their pace, as opposed to the slower, more controlled.
The more controlled pace pure boxers used to.
There's also the level of the fighter to think about. A-level pressure fighter, A-level pure boxer, B-level, C-level, D-level, all that jazz. Not all pressure fighters are created equal, you understand, and the same rings true for pure boxers. So there is the level at which the fighter operates to also think about, and what specific nuances and characteristics they bring to the table as an individual, though characteristically, the pressure fighter does have a stylistic advantage over the pure boxer.
At minimum, they can make that pure boxer uncomfortable.
And if they're on the level, the same level, that pressure fighter can beat that pure boxer. A-level pure boxer versus A-level pressure fighter. B-level pure boxer versus B-level pressure fighter. Oh, yeah.
That being said, in a little while, I think Skye will be ready to fight for a world title.
Specific to this conversation, I think she could be ready for a Sarah Mahfoud in just a few fights. But when it comes to a fighter like Erica Cruz, she would do wise to steer clear of her for the time being, while she's still making her bones and earning her stripes as a professional.
Avoid her at all costs.
In men's super middleweight news, unbeaten Cuban up-and-comer David Morrell was in action against Henderson.
Calvin Henderson, who he stopped in 4 rounds.
David Morrell, very strong puncher, statuesque for this division, very generous physical dimensions for a super middleweight.
David's base style lives somewhere between an aggressive boxer puncher and a pressure guy.
Somewhere in the middle, somewhere in between there, because David Morrell can so obviously box and use his jab to set up other punches.
You can see that this guy can box.
He can box when he wants to, but he's got a mean streak. He characteristically throws a lot of punches and applies a lot of pressure. It's for this reason that his base style lives somewhere in between a very aggressive boxer puncher and a pressure fighter, bordering on one. He can throw combinations, put punches together, and make things very difficult for a guy, or he can pick his punches.
He can exhibit all the volume of the pressure fighter.
Or he can take a more nuanced, methodical approach and pick his punches. Pick which punches he wants to throw to break down the other guy's guard, break down the other guy's defenses. He was in action against Calvin Henderson, who he battered over 4 rounds. We know that David Morrell has taken a liking to calling out 2-time former super middleweight champion David Benavidez, and we also know that David Benavidez' promoter, Samson Lukowicz, he threw David Morrell's name in the hat for David Benavidez' next fight, which could take place this fall.
I like that fucking fight.
Because it's an interesting stylistic matchup involving two guys who stylistically are more ferocity than finesse. You know, David Benavidez, more often than not, he has the look of a physically imposing pressure fighter, as most of the guys he fights, they can't seem to contend with his size, his punching power, and his volume. David Benavidez throws a lot of punches. The same rings true for the less experienced David Morrell, who doesn't even have 10 pro fights.
Less experienced, albeit very capable and ambitious.
He must be if he doesn't even have 10 fights yet, and he's already angling for a fight with David Benavidez. In truth,
objectively speaking, they should try to get David Morrell more fights and more pro experience.
if they wish to keep him in the winner's bracket. Objectively speaking, he doesn't necessarily need a David Benavidez fight right now. But speaking as a boxing fan, just a boxing fan, because I don't get paid to manage none of these guys.
I'm nobody's fucking manager, I'm nobody's fucking fanager.
If David Morrell and his team think they're ready for that fight, and they want that fucking fight now, I'm more than happy to watch it.
Whether he's ready for it or not.
The fun part is finding out. The fun part for the fight fan, because David Morrell has been insistent for some months now that he wants to get David Benavidez in the ring. And it being that David Morrell, as opposed to Caleb Plant, as opposed to Jermall Charlo, David Morrell is a cheaper alternative.
Yeah, you don't have to pay David Morrell what you'd have to pay Jermall Charlo or Caleb Plant.
No, you don't. This is a guy who ain't even got fights in the double digits yet, because you don't have to pay this guy what you'd have to pay those guys. It's a viable option. It's a route that the Benavidez people might so choose to peruse this fall, and it makes for a great fight.
A fan-friendly fight.
I reviewed the footage of Morrell versus Henderson this past weekend. David Morrell continues to look formidable, look a strong puncher and a capable boxer, but some areas of concern I saw are mid-range to inside for the Cuban slugger. He does seem susceptible to counter hooks, counter left hooks and right hooks, as Calvin Henderson got off a few of those as David rained down blows upon him. He snuck some of those shots through, and they actually found a home. They actually landed.
Can he take a counter left hook from a David Benavidez?
David Morrell exhibits a great variety of punches. He really does. Straight shots from the outside coming in as he steps into those shots. Good uppercuts mid-range to inside. Good right hooks to the body. David Morrell is a southpaw.
And he doesn't abandon the body. I like that.
He's got a mean streak. He's a guy who can so obviously box if he needs to box, but he likes to lay into his opponents. He likes to punish guys, go for the knockout. What is characteristic of either a boxer puncher or a pressure fighter. They're not fighting for a points win. They're fighting to take you out.
Not for dinner, sweetheart.
We're not talking about a nightcap. We're talking about going night-night. David Morrell has a mean streak, and the same rings true for David Benavidez. He's another guy. He goes in there, he wants to hurt you.
The edge and experience so obviously has to go to David Benavidez because he's a 2-time super middleweight champion.
He has 26 professional fights, 26 fights, 23 knockouts to David Morrell's 7.
7 fights and 6 knockouts.
The edge and experience will have to go to David Benavidez, though what makes this fight a tasty fight is that this time, David won't be the only aggressive puncher with punching power in the ring. Oftentimes, David Benavidez is the biggest puncher in the room.
David won't be the only guy with power.
And he won't be the only guy named David.
Think that'll make a difference?
Well, it didn't make a difference for David Lemieux, but it could make things interesting with David Morrell.
Being named David?
No, having punching power. What are you, a moron?
It's a very interesting situation.
David Morrell, unlike some other fighters, he does have the option of fighting fire with fire because he's a bit of a destructive puncher the same way that David Benavidez is a destructive puncher. He's destructive, albeit less experienced, and he has the ability to box, to turn this into a boxing match where he sets up his power shots as opposed to just going for volume and activity. So it's a very interesting fight, and it might actually happen. I can't wait to see this if they get it over the line this fall. And finally, just in keeping with the theme of this past weekend's action, in the Bantamweight division, Australia's own Jason Maloney was in action against Ashton Palikte on the undercard of Haney versus Kambosos Jr., and he knocked out Ashton Palikte. You know, the predictions stuck. I did go with Jason to win the fight. I picked him to win on points. He did a little better than that.
There were 2 baby belts on the line in this
A
fight.
WBC baby belt and a WBO baby belt. But you will notice that even before the fight, Jason Maloney seems to have his eyes on a Paul Butler fight. Paul Butler, newly crowned WBO Bantamweight champion, after John Riel Casimero was caught in violation of the BBBOC's rules using saunas ahead of a fight. You're not supposed to do that. He got himself stripped, and the title went to Paul.
And Jason Maloney's had his eyes on that guy ever since.
Had his eyes on a Paul Butler fight before this past weekend's fight, and post-fight, he still has his eyes on that guy, saying, I want Paul Butler next.
After stopping Ashton Palikte in the 3rd round.
You will also notice that in the WBO's last set of updated rank standings, the May edition, Jason Maloney ranks in at number 3. It's conceivable that with this knockout win over Ashton Palikte, he may gain ground. He may gain ground over America's own Rousey Warren, who hasn't boxed since August of last year. It's been roughly 10 or 11 months since he saw action. At number 1 is former WBO champion John Riel Casimero, and I wouldn't be at all surprised to see Jason Maloney gain ground on him as well.
You know, Bob Arum, he seems real sweet on Jason Maloney, don't he?
And Bob Arum has always had a way with the WBO. Initially, I thought that Maloney versus Palikte was a WBO final eliminator. Apparently, that wasn't the case, though Jason is very close to becoming the WBO's mandatory challenger, the mandatory challenger for Paul Butler's belt. And Paul, he's got to do some soul searching. He's got to make a decision. Tomorrow morning,
Yeah.
here stateside,
Yeah.
we're going to be seeing drama in Saitama 2, set to go down in the Far East, the land of the rising sun. Nonito Donaire and Naoya Inoue will be locking horns for the second time, except this time there will be 3 alphabet titles on the line as opposed to just 2. And if Paul Butler knows what's good for him, he pursues the winner of that fight, and he pursues them immediately, because Jason Maloney is hot on his trail.
Jason Maloney's been winning fights and looking good doing it.
Beat Joshua Greer last year, the very capable Joshua Greer. He knocked out Ashton Palikte this year.
Ashton Palikte.
Paul Butler, a 2-time world champion, he's not getting any younger. He's getting long in the tooth. He's in his mid-30s. And, you know, you go running risks with Jason, you don't make it to the winner of Inoue versus Donaire 2. You don't make it to the winner of that fight. Not if you sit on your hands and wait, as opposed to pushing for that fight.
Push to get the winner of Inoue versus Donaire 2 in the ring. Do what you gotta do, because you won't make losing to Jason what you'll make losing to them.
More importantly, we all stand a better chance of seeing an undisputed champion crowned in today's bantamweight division if it comes down to Paul and the winner of that fight, as opposed to if it comes down to Jason and the winner of that fight. If by some chance Jason gets Paul in the ring and he beats him and he becomes this division's WBO champion,
Look, let's say Naoya Inoue wins tomorrow.
and let's say that instead of pursuing Naoya Inoue, Paul Butler sits on his hands, waits around, and the WBO ends up ordering him to fight Jason Maloney.
If he loses to Jason Maloney and Jason becomes WBO champion,
Naoya Inoue beat him already. He stopped him. Nobody wants to see a second fight, even if it is for undisputed championship status.
it's just me speaking as a fight fan.
Objectively speaking, just evaluating the situation, Paul Butler stands to make more money facing the winner of that fight as opposed to defending his title against Jason Maloney. He could lose that fight.
Paul needs to get on the ball and make sure he gets the winner of that fight.
And he needs to do it quickly,